Hey guys, let's go ahead and talk about Federalist 51 here. So Federalist 51 is probably one of the most important Federalist papers in terms of trying to understand what the framers were thinking. James Madison, a lot of times he gets credited, as the father of the Constitution. It's a great thing to put on a headstone. The Constitution was a collaborative document. It was built by the people at the Constitutional Convention after lots of fighting, arguing, and compromise to build a document that the majority of the 13 states could agree on. But Madison's hand is like the steady one on the wheel. He's the one that really had the most say into what the final structure of our government's going to look like. So, calling Madison the father of the Constitution is a totally adequate, title for him to have. And in Federalist 51, he really gives us the best, looking at the Constitution from its bare bones. What is it doing? How does it work? And why should we support it? So Federalist 51 is probably one of the most important ones, and it's why it's the first Federalist paper you guys are reading. So the first question is, what's his primary argument in Federalist 51? The goal here is that the critique he's addressing is that the Constitution creates a tyrannical government. Anti-federalists are out there saying that this is worse than having a king, because at least a king is a target. The Constitution is a faceless king, and whoever's in control of the federal government can dominate the states. So Federalist 51 is Madison saying, look, yes, it's a stronger government than the Articles of Confederation established, but it is not tyranny, and it is not a faceless king. That's why he spends so much time on the separation of powers and checks and balances in Federalist 51, because he's saying, look, these are the safeties. This is why it's not a dangerous weapon for whoever happens to be in control of the federal government at a time. The checks and balances and the separation of powers are designed purposefully to create a powerful but limited government. Madison is not an optimist. His quote in number 2, "If men were angels, no governments would be necessary," is him speaking directly to his worldview. He's not an optimist about human behavior. He's not a pessimist, but he's realistic. You can only trust people so much. You can only give people so much power. Humans have a natural tendency to want to accumulate power for safety, and those tend to lead to abuses and corruption. So the checks and balances and the separation of powers are purposely designed with that in mind. It's not hoping that we have perfect people that will govern us perfectly. The Constitution's built for the worst. It's built for people you can't trust. It's built on people. It's built accepting that it will create a government that will be filled with people who have suspect motives, who want to abuse power, who want to be corrupt. And the system is supposed to be designed to check those abilities. So when he says, if men were angels, no governments would be necessary, it's very telling. It's one of my favorite Madison quotes, that he doesn't trust people. He doesn't trust people to govern themselves because people can be corrupted. He doesn't trust governments to govern themselves because people make up governments, especially in a republic like they're creating. And so you have to have mechanisms for limiting those people's ability to abuse the power, even if they really, really want to. These guys are Enlightenment philosopher students. Like, they've studied the classics, they've read Locke, they've read Hobbes. They know that you can only give humans so much power, and the problem with kings was that it was an individual who had all of the power. And so borrowing from Montesquieu and using the separation of powers to divide power away from individuals. Now you've got you've got an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, and no one of them can ever control all of the government at once. That's the whole idea of the separation of powers. But Madison knows that you can't just trust that by dividing power out, it will stay divided. He talks about there's a natural tendency for power to accumulate, for it to recoalesce. You can divide power into 3 branches, but eventually there might be a group of people who successfully control all those branches and merge the intent of that power together and act tyrannically. So the Constitution built in the checks and balances purposefully to split them apart even more. It's not just that the powers are separated, it's that they're separated and pitted against each other. They're built to be at odds. My favorite complaint from people, it tends to be that if the president is not getting along with Congress, then there's something wrong, and that our politicians need to work together to get along. That's wrong. James Madison would hate that idea. James Madison thinks that presidents and Congresses should never get along. That was kind of the whole idea behind giving presidents the power to veto legislation, but only Congress can write legislation. You've immediately pitted them against each other. So when they try to gain more power, it prevents the other branches from gaining more power. And so it's a very ingenious way of giving people power and then using their desire to accumulate more power to actively prevent other parts of the government from gaining that power. And so they just keep doing that back and forth to each other and create a balance. As far as terminology that you guys were defining, I think you did a perfectly reasonable job. This is a 18th century document. There are going to be words that are perfectly English, but very unfamiliar. So your answers may have varied there. I didn't see anything too egregious. Most of you guys picked words that were, common for the time, have very clear meanings. They were just unfamiliar with. You were just unfamiliar with, like prudence. Prudence just means good judgment. So he's building a government built on prudence, of having people make good decisions and use good judgment. Because they're not angels. I just love that. It's such a fun quote. If men were angels, no governments would be necessary, but because men aren't angels, we have to have governments, and those governments have to be secure, not only from the people, but from the people in government. Key ideas number 1, in a Republican form of government, which branch should be the strongest and why? It's very clear because of the focus that Madison puts on it that he believed that the legislator should be the most powerful branch. Look at the order of the Constitution, guys. The Constitution is Article 1, the legislative branch, Article 2, the executive branch, and Article 3, the judicial branch. There's a very clear meaning there. They intended for Congress to be the most powerful branch. That makes sense. The power to make law is the preeminent government power. What's ingenious is they then made Congress a labyrinthian maze for policy to try to get through. So Congress isn't just one chamber. It's bicameral. There's 2 chambers. There's a House and a Senate, and they are built differently. People are elected to the House from districts within their states. People are selected to be senators by state legislators. So they're already coming to power in 2 different ways. The House has members based on states' populations. Every state gets 2 senators. So the number of representatives a state's going to have in each chamber are going to be different. So you have all of these mechanisms in place to make them different, to make the chambers behave differently. We'll talk more about this in the Congress chapter, but the House is more rambunctious. The House gets fired up. People get excited in the House. People go wild in the House. Last year there was a congresswoman who got in trouble after the 2018 election for swearing at an event that the party held to celebrate the results of the election. And everyone's like, oh my goodness, how could she swear? This is the House of Representatives, guys. This is a wild place. People go nuts in there. The Senate is cooler, is calmer. They serve longer terms. They're supposed to be more elite members of society. There are only 100 of them, so just numerically, they're more elite. There are fewer of them. They're exclusive. It's a hoity-toity club. Senators tend to be older people, which in Congress is really pushing it. I mean, there have been some senators who are truly archaic in terms of their age. Like, they are holdovers from another era. Some of them even have fun with it. Like Bernie Sanders is like 84 years old. The previous oldest member of the Senate who retired, I believe, was like 92. Like, there's some very old people in the Senate. So it tends to move a little bit slower, even physically. They knew that one of the big flaws of the Articles of Confederation was that the Articles didn't have an executive to enforce the law. So they wanted the president to be powerful, but also independent of Congress. There was actually a plan to have the Congress choose the president. An element of that plan still exists if the Electoral College that chooses the president has a tie or nobody wins a majority, then the House of Representatives picks the president and the Senate picks the vice president. So they wanted there to be a stronger executive, but it still needed to be an executive that was purposefully limited. Number two, according to Madison, how's the separation of powers between the branches guaranteed by the Constitution? And what's the responsibilities of each branch? So the separation of powers is the Constitution. Like, it's literally the physical structure of it. Article 1, 2, and 3 is a separation of powers. There are lots of checks and balances. I'm actually going to put together a second video here that goes through all the checks and balances, or not all, but like the major checks and balances between all the branches. But they're all built on the idea that even though Congress has the power to make laws can't go into effect until another branch has had a say in it. In this case, the executive. Congress can make laws, but the courts interpret the meaning behind those laws, which can actually shape how those laws then get enforced. So each branch has specific responsibilities. Their responsibilities are to their powers. So executive power belongs to the president, legislative power belongs to the Congress, and judicial power belongs to the courts. The implementation of those tends to involve the checks and balances to keep them at odds. And last key ideas question, two ways in which the federal system of the United States places that system in a very interesting point of view and protects against tyranny. So there were a lot of different ways you could go with this. You could talk about the division of power at the federal level into branches, with each branch getting specific powers and checks, but then also talking about how the system is then further divided by having federalism injected into it and keeping the powers of the federal government separate from the powers of the state governments. So the federal government does have some incredible powers. The powers to make war, collect taxes, print and coin money, raise an army. Those are, very important, large, substantial powers. But the states numerically win. They have so many more powers. The states have so much more power to impact your life on a day-to-day basis because the states get any power not already given to the federal government. And you have to have circumstances play out through like the necessary and proper clause in order for the federal government to expand its power. But they've got to make a really strong argument for that, especially in the modern era, for that power to be expanded. The courts have kind of found their equilibrium. They know about how much power they want to let Congress have, and they know when they want to defer to the states. It's always in flux, but they've definitely settled on kind of a nice balance, over centuries of Supreme Court cases. So having the ability to check the government both at the federal level through the separation of powers, but also check the government using federalism by then dividing most of the power away from the federal government and giving it to the states to create that double security. So that's it for Federalist 51. Again, things to keep in mind as far as like questions about it on the AP test. Remember it's about the separation of powers and checks and balances. Remember that Madison is arguing from a position of don't be afraid of the Constitution because these systems will be very effective in limiting how much power the federal government will be able to exercise. So keep those things in mind when you're thinking about Federalist 51 going forward.